Welcome, everyone, to the third installment of Image Think series, Ask the Expert, where I sit down remotely with leaders and innovators and get to explore the practical applications of their knowledge and how it might apply to us, to our life, work, and in business. If you don't know me, I'm Nora Herding, CEO and founder of Image Think, a visual facilitator, graphic recorder, thinker, and author. And these events really are for you. They're Q&A opportunities for all of you to join in with questions that you have. So please type out your questions in the chat and we'll address them. I'm also joined today by a number of people from the Image Think team. I just want to acknowledge, you'll see on the screen the work of the talented Claude Lee, who's going to be graphic recording our conversation today. Matt Molina, the man behind the curtain, and Sam Horvath. So thanks to all of you for making this happen. Now, I know we have a lot of graphic recorders, sketchnoters, and illustrators joining today. And today our guest really needs no introduction. However, for those of you and the rest of us, Mike Rohde is a true modern day Renaissance man. He's a designer, author of 2 best-selling books, Sketchnote Handbook and Sketchnote Workbook, both of which have been borrowed from the Image Think library and are so good they've never been returned. If you have my copy, I want it back. He's also a speaker, an illustrator, a publisher, a podcaster, and I believe across all of these disciplines, a teacher and a father. So thank you so much, Mike, for joining us here today from, tell us where you're joining from, Mike.
Well, I'm coming from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Thank you for having me on the show. It's really fun.
Yeah, so that's one thing that we have in common. I think we have a lot in common, but I also lived in Milwaukee, Wisconsin as a child for a couple of years. So love the Midwest. And my sister is officially a cheesehead as she was born. She was born there. So Mike, I want to start with addressing a question that's on the top of everyone's list. We, for those of us who don't really know what Sketchnote is, can you tell us, how do you define it to an everyday person? What's the difference between sketchnoting and regular noting, or sketchnoting and doodling?
Oh, that's a good question. So I would say sketchnoting is a mix of visuals and words together. So that's really at the core of it. It's a mix of the two. So I think of them as forming a dance in a way. So the words support the pictures and the pictures support the words. And it's a way of capturing information that you're consuming, that you're taking in. Now that could be a TED Talk, it could be a board meeting, it could be a really delicious dinner or a travel experience, it could be watching a TV show or a movie. Anything that you can experience and you can draw meaning and ideas from really could be a sketch note. And it's a mix of drawing with writing. And sort of the crossover between drawing and the writing might be lettering, right? So taking the words that you're doing and actually giving them visual interest, making them bolder or compressed or wider or scripty, right? So those are some ways that you can represent words as lettering, and that just draws attention to those items and gives them emphasis over other things. So you've got a hierarchy of structure that you're working with. So it's easy for you as the one who made it to come back and make sense out of what you captured. Or if you share a sketch note with someone else, it helps them to understand the structure and the flow of the thinking that you were going through as you captured those ideas.
Yeah, that's great. And I'm noticing, in your language, you're using terms like hierarchy and structure. Mm-hmm. And I'm reminded that your background is as a designer. Yeah. And I'm curious, how has that sort of informed your approach to sketchnoting?
Well, it's kind of funny you say that. In a lot of ways, I feel like sketchnoting has been my way to teach design to people who have had no design teaching. So I went to design school. It was really a technical college, but I learned the basics of design, all those things you mentioned: hierarchy, structure, white space, lettering, which you might see as typography, use of imagery to convey and communicate. Really, it's ultimately communication. And so I've always looked at sketchnoting. It's a hand-done thing you're doing with your hand, right? You're writing and you're drawing with your hand. And so you have to think about these structural things because you're trying to make sense of the information and give some shape to it, right? Because if you just see a transcript of an interview or something, it could just be, lines and lines and lines of text. There is nothing is emphasized or amplified, or, some things may be more important to you than others. And this is your opportunity to define that difference of what makes more sense or what applies to what you're doing and what stuff is maybe not as important to you. So there is definitely a personal aspect to sketchnoting, I believe, that maybe that separates a little bit from, say, a professional graphic recorder like you and your team, right? They have to come in and provide almost like as neutral as a human can be, perspective on information and not insert themselves. And in that sense, sketchnoting has a slightly different angle, that it's something that you do for yourself, and you can put some of your personality and your opinion into the ideas that you're capturing on the page. Because ultimately, my thought around sketchnoting was, it's something that you capture information so you can do action, right? We learn so that we can apply and use, not necessarily just for more information, right? Just loading up on information, it's really great for trivia, but not really useful for work and the things that you're doing in action. So I always think of like theory and action go hand in hand. So you learn things, but then you find ways to apply them, or see how they connect to other things so that you can make sense and help other people.
Yeah, that's great. I'm so happy to hear you mention, what your definition of sketchnoting is and how it's different than what we do at ImageThink, And I think we first met at South by Southwest. I want to say it was 2011,
Yeah.
where you were hosting a meetup with Moleskine, I remember. And that's how I always thought about it too, is that sketchnoting is really a personal, if you even think of, usually the scale that folks work on, it's a very individual scale. It's
right.
Diaristic. A lot of, of your early work that I was exposed to was very diaristic. And I think about it as being on that scale, and a matter of interpreting is really for the author, the artist, where when you're in a graphic facilitator, graphic recording setting, I feel like we're almost like a medium, being neutral, holding the space for a number of different viewpoints and having to synthesize those. But the techniques that you mentioned before, the structural techniques like hierarchy, structure, format, white space, those are all obviously things that we broker into. So I think that's the similarity as well. I just want to stop and note, we have some amazing people joining us from all over nearby to us here at ImageThink as New Jersey, but Albania, Germany, Stockholm. So all of you, we really would love to hear from you too. So as we're chatting, put your questions right in, and that'll be your opportunity to hear directly from Mike as well. So I'm curious, Mike, you mentioned being a designer. Do you remember sort of the first sketchnote you took, or the first thing that you recognized as being a sketchnote, and what was the topic at hand?
Well, it's really funny. When I look back in time, even to my college and even, I guess, high school, I was actually doing sketchnoting, but I didn't have a word for it. And the funny thing is, I encounter people who will come to me and say, "Oh, I've been doing sketchnoting for years. I just never knew what to call it." But for me, the real like turning point, or the place where I actually made a decision that, hey, this is sketchnoting, was early in 2007, and I went to a design conference in Chicago. And I went to try and make sense of information, how to improve myself as a designer. So what I focused on was really process. So I was, in the past before this, I had somehow gotten into this weird place where I was recording everything in a giant notebook. I used a pencil so I could erase mistakes. So this is like a 9x12 notebook with lined pages. And I felt this, I don't know where this came from, but like a compulsion to write everything down, or as much as possible. So, I just felt like this requirement to write everything. And it just got to the point where it was unsustainable. I couldn't keep going with it. And the weird thing was, I had all this drawing stuff in my history, and I don't know how it got lost in the process. I think when I look back, I sort of got into computers at that time, and I think the transition back to paper, I just carried sort of a typing mindset, except without the keyboard. So I got to this unsustainable point late in 2006. I said, I can't do it this way anymore. As a designer, almost always faced with a constraint of some kind or another. And sometimes it's good, I think this can be a practice we can take away, is putting a constraint on yourself to see what happens, do an experiment. So my experiment was this. What if I go 180 degrees opposite from where I was? Big notebook, pencil, write everything down. What if I inverted the whole thing? So then I said, well, what if I take this moleskin notebook that I bought a month ago and is still sitting unwrapped on my desk? What if I use that? Okay, there's my medium. And I don't want to use pencil. What if I use pen? What if I challenge myself to use a pen? So right there, two of those elements, using a small notebook and a pen, pushed me into a place where I could not write everything down because I simply didn't have enough pages. And I had a pen, so if I had mistakes, there was no way to correct them. So I had to be really careful. I had to be really thoughtful about what I put on those pages from both of those parts. And that led me to the third aspect, which I think is a really big key to sketchnoting, which is trying to get to the root of the big idea. And how does that big idea, how can I take something out of it and apply it? So you can see I'm really into this practical application side of things, right? I love theory. I love to think about things, but I also love to apply things. Like, it's never good enough just to learn about it and let it sit in a library of my mind, but how can I apply this idea? So I went to this conference in Chicago. I had this small notebook. I had a gel pen. I think it was a Pilot G2. And I just said, let's see what happens. And faced with the situation of not having to write everything down, suddenly I felt like I had all this free time. Like, I don't have to write everything. I have all this free time. So then I started fooling around with lettering because I love lettering and typography. I started doing that. And then there were images on the screen that were interesting. Well, I have all kinds of free time. Why don't I start sketching what I'm seeing? And so I started sketching images. And then, of course, I was still writing, but I was writing much less. I was listening for key information and trying to focus on that. And so once I started into the groove of it, I really enjoyed it. By the end of the conference, I had so much fun that I shared those sketch notes on Flickr, which was in 2006 was the hot social media platform. And the interesting thing that the last part of it was posting it on Flickr. There were people that were at the conference that actually had presented, and they were really surprised by the work that I did and really liked it and made comments. But then the real mind changer was when people who were not at the event, who were just looking from afar, who happened to follow me on Flickr, saw the sketch notes that I did and found them really useful, that they felt that there was value in them, that they might consider going to this conference if it came near them. So there was some value, even though I'd intended it for myself. There was some value bound into this work of analysis and sense making and visualization of ideas in a really compact form. And then ultimately it was great because unlike the books where I wrote everything down, which I never looked at, I never actually went back and found value in, these I could flip through in 5 or 10 minutes and get the gist of the whole event in a really compact way. So in a lot of ways, it solved pretty much every problem that I faced with the old way I was taking notes, if that makes sense.
That's great. Yeah, I love that story. I also, it was 2006 when I sort of got into this line of work too. And this brings me to some other questions I'm sure our audience is interested in. And specifically also we have someone joining us, Dave Stadler, who's wondering about this for practical applications for business folks. But when people first start, you had this experience of trying to synthesize, or maybe not synthesize, right? Just capture every word that you could. And I love that analogy of like taking the idea of typing and just translating it back, losing that sense of drawing. And we all learned how to draw, right? And how did we get so far away from it? But as people are interested in, taking steps to create their own sketch notes, or in the case, maybe apply this in a work setting, what do you feel like are some things that beginners struggle with, or tips that you might have around approach?
Well, I think the really big one is one you touched on just a second ago, the ability to draw. So lots of people, maybe in business, maybe the last time they drew was when they were 12 years old in junior high school or something, right? So there's this huge gap. I would say that in some ways it probably equals or maybe is even more scary than public speaking, because like public speaking, you're sharing the way you think and what you how you process information, except you're doing it with 12-year-old drawing skills, right? So there's this fear, like if I'm a CEO of a company, I'm well regarded, and then I draw like a 12-year-old, what are people going to think of me? So I'm just not going to draw or profusely apologize for my bad drawing. That's not so much of a great solution either, right? Because you're now admitting some failing, which might be a challenge. So pretty quickly, when it came to the point of doing the books specifically, the challenge was how do we teach people to draw simply in a way that they can understand and absorb and apply, that will make it give them a little more confidence to move forward to the next thing, right? If you feel like you can't draw well or at all, like sketchnoting is pretty much off the table, right? So that was the first challenge that I faced, and in the book, after sort of contemplating what those challenges were and how to solve it, I realized a lot of the way that I drew wasn't so much observational drawing. It was more, how do I structure images in a simple way? Because when you're in a situation where you're sketchnoting, graphic recording, you don't have a lot of time, right? You have to move quickly. You have to have a simple way to draw things. And so I broke it down to basically 5 elements: a square, a circle, a triangle, a line, and a dot. And I sort of specifically chose those 5 because they were so rememberable. I think the Dunbar number is like 5 plus or minus 2. So it fell within that range that it was pretty rememberable. And it sort of ended up being a blessing because it got people into a mindset when I shared it with them that it was more like working with a set of Lego blocks than it was drawing. So it was, you have these elements that you are sort of confined to. So again, here come the constraints again. And now you're just putting these constrained elements together to make images. So, and that gives you the flexibility of circles can be ovals, and squares can be rectangles or parallelograms, or right. So there's actually a lot more variation in these 5 elements if you push the boundaries. And ultimately, all these are made up of a bunch of dots sort of lined up in a certain way. So if you really wanted to boil it down to one element of drawing, it's a dot. But I didn't think that would sell many books, so I spread it out a little bit and really made it sort of simple and rememberable. I know there's other people in the visual thinking space who have more elements of drawing, and I think that's okay. I just felt like 5 was real rememberable, and it was easy to teach it, and people responded to it. And in the many workshops that I've taught this concept, that this is always the foundational first hour of any workshop that I do, because I've just seen it work too many times. Like I go into a room and I ask people who thinks they can't draw, and 80% of the room's hands go up. And by the end of the 1 hour, these people all feel like they can confidently draw a little bit better than when they came in the door. And that's a huge win because it sort of moves them past the first, tripping point into actually trying things, right? Like, I just want you to feel like you're in a safe place and you can try things out. And by giving you this really simple structure, it puts you in a safe space where you can explore and experiment and try these things. And then you can sort of open yourself up to, wow, I actually can draw these things in a simple way if I approach it a different way than I thought I should. And, that leads to my big mantra is ideas, not art. And it sounds really provocative, but in a sense, it's not. It's just, it's really ordering. It's like, maybe it's more like ideas then art, right? Like there's so much baggage around art for people like that CEO hasn't drawn since they were in middle school, right? If there's a burden or a worry about drawing, if you take that away because you're focusing on the ideas, like, well, I'm just drawing ideas, is not going in a gallery, it sort of drops all the pressure a lot and makes it possible for someone to begin. Because ultimately that's where we have the big trouble, is just starting someplace, right? If you don't start, you're never going to progress. So the real spark is that starting. And I felt like way down deep at the core for anybody who wants to do the sketchnoting is it's to really simplify what you consider drawing and use this simple way of approaching it, and then think of it as just putting these pieces together as a starting place. And then you can go, the sky's the limit as far as you want to push, making this into art if you wish, but you don't feel like you have to do art to begin.
Right. Yeah. So Dave Stadler's question about business people and how do we get them to stop, stop the flow of working or doing so they could take small steps. Mm-hmm. I think you zoned in on what the barrier is, and I've encountered that too. People who think that they can't draw, it does seem really intimidating. And I have to tell you that I've used the your kind of alphabet before in trainings we've done. And honestly, I'm like, oh, this seems so elementary.
Right.
But one person once said, oh, everything about today, like after we did this exercise, they were just like, their mind was blown. They said, this was the best thing ever. I'm like, really? We just talked about, like you make a house with a square and a triangle. It seems, to me, like so self-evident, but it's so empowering to people to be reminded of how simple it can be. And so perhaps Dave, to take that to heart is introduce, that one exercise. I've seen it be effective even in like a 15-minute window where you kind of go through that basic, those basic building blocks, if you will. So there's another question here, which is Helmut from Germany, thank you, is asking how you developed your own personal style of sketchnoting. And I thought that this would be a great question because this will also give us an opportunity of maybe putting up some of the work that you've done that we've had the privilege of looking at as well.
Yeah, that would be great. I think I would say at first, like we talk about the 5 basic shapes, right? If you're just beginning, don't worry about style yet. Like you're just building the foundational pieces to get yourself comfortable with drawing. But I think I'm a fan and a friend of Austin Kleon, and he says whatever you do is your style, right? So I think if I look back at my style, and I believe this about other people, is everything you've done up to this point is feeding your style perspective, right? It's the billboards you see, the comics you read, the movies you like, the music you like, all those things feed into it. And it produces sort of a way of looking at the world. And, what you take in can influence that. So if you're interested, like if you get beyond the basics, like if you feel like you want to have a style, because in many cases, someone might just be happy with being able to draw is like enough for them, right? Like they never maybe want to exceed this basic idea drawing thing. And that's just fine, right? If that works for them, that's really what it's all about. But if you want to go to the next level and develop a style, that's where I think it can be really helpful to sort of pick some favorites or be a fan of certain styles. So if I look back in my history, I was a huge fan in the 80s of a comic called Daredevil, and there was an artist for Daredevil, Frank Miller, who many later know as he was, I think, the director or producing of Sin City, had other influences on other culture, but at the time, his style of Daredevil was really different from every other comic that at least I had experienced. It had sort of a really bold style. I think he was using lots of ink. He also really looked at, like, if you think about comics, like they traditionally have these panels, and they tended to be regular, and they, you just sort of got into a rhythm with them. He never accepted that. He would break panels across spreads. He would make a panel run all the way from the bottom of the page to the top of the page. Sometimes he would take one image and spread it across a whole 2-page spread. So he was really pushing the boundaries of what comics could do, and his style was really bold. So I think that was a heavy influence on me as well as other artists. So for developing your own style, I would say start looking around for the stuff you admire. And maybe actually the first place to start is simply to copy that stuff, right? I think copying is a really valuable way to learn what you like about something. By copying it, you understand what is it that I like and don't like, especially if you're trying to be aware of it. What is difficult? Like, wow, that's harder than I thought it would be, right? That makes you really appreciate that other person's work in a new way because you realize what they've gone through to achieve it. But it also helps guide you, like, do I really like that enough to incorporate it? And then how can I put a little twist on it to make it mine, right? So there's all these inputs, and then I think your own personality sort of puts it in the spin cycle, and then what comes out over time becomes your style. And I think it's a natural progression, and I think it changes a little bit over time, but I think it's a reflection of personality, and it's what I love about sketchnotes that I see is I love seeing the variety of styles, and I love that I can spot something and say, oh, that's Mauro Ticelli. Ooh, that's Rob DeMeo. Ooh, that's Ivedalato Lamb, right? My favorite friends or other people, I start identifying their styles just simply by looking at it, almost the way when I was a young graphic designer, I could identify typefaces. I started to just really study them, like what was unique about Gil Sans that made it unique. And so when I would see that character, I could say, oh, that's a Gil Sans, right? Because the R looks a certain way, or whatever the characteristic was. In the same way, you can do that with people's styles.
Great. Well, to that point, I think we have some of your work through different topics and times to maybe take a look at now, Matt, if you want to put those up, some of them. I know that what is interesting to me is that you've covered so many different topics. As you were talking about getting started, it was the design conference, but I also know that, that you also like on Sundays to Sketchnote church services that you attend. Mm-hmm. So how, and we'll look at these in a minute, is there certain topics that you find more enjoyable, or ones that you find personally a little bit more challenging? Or how does the topic potentially change your approach, if at all, to some of the design elements you've talked about?
That's some interesting questions. So I really like, so the sermon story was basically, I attend church every Sunday. Used to be in person, now we're doing it remotely, and eventually we'll go back. But I sort of realized sitting there, like, wait a minute, I have 35 or 40 minutes of opportunity to really push some boundaries, to test things, and to experiment and practice. If anything, I'm just practicing, even if it's not like the best sketchnote I've ever done. Like, to keep myself active and continuously practicing was a good pressure, I thought. And so I just started bringing my notebook and doing this work. And then when I had the iPad Pro, I started doing the iPad Pro for a variety of reasons, some of which are just speed and editability if I wanted to edit things, and I built a workflow around that. So each Sunday I attend service either virtually or in person, and I use the iPad Pro to capture the concepts and produce them. And as it turned out, again, it's sort of this, I did it for myself as practice, but it turned out to be an interesting solution for the other parishioners, because once the leadership team at the church found I was doing this, they invited me to share that with the leadership team. And now when they post audio of the sermons or video and questions for the small groups that talk about them, they always include the sketchnote that I've done if I do one. And then I've heard from many parishioners that prepare for small groups that they'll often listen to the audio and look at the sketchnote as they're listening and sort of follow it and use it as a quick reference as they're part of their preparation. So I really never intended it to be that, but I'm really happy that it worked out that way. So I think sometimes what you think is not important can actually be really valuable to other people. So that's something I've learned from doing the sketchnoting stuff, that even though it is first for me, it can be valuable for other people. And as far as other stuff that I like to do, I like eating. I like delicious food. I love experiences. So sketchnoting my food experiences is really fun. Usually I'm smart enough to eat first and take photos, and then I'll sketchnote from the photos, because I don't want to ruin that experience. And I've had some really great experiences I feel fortunate to capture. As an example, was able to go to Chez Panisse out in Berkeley many years ago to the cafe on one night on a work trip, and two of my colleagues and I happened to be there. I happened to have my notebook and my pen, and I sketchnoted the experience. And even looking at that really rough black and white sketchnote, which only really captures a little bit of information, it really brings back that memory. The whole memory comes back. And so I've done it in other cases, like I love Thai food, so Thai restaurants.
Yeah, I was so happy that you pulled these food ones, which I happened to just see. I know they're from several years back, but yeah. What I loved about them was, I recognized that you were using like an oil, like a brush pen, so it's a different tool, which of course really changes the way you can capture. When you were mentioning how you moved from a pencil to a pen, when we're training people at ImageThink, oftentimes, again, back to thinking about the difference of what we do and you do, is what we're doing is for service for a group, so the scale is much bigger. Mm-hmm. But oftentimes when people get started, they're used to drawing for themselves, so sometimes the font is too small. So One way to rectify that is we make them use like the biggest marker possible. Yeah, so it was interesting to see, you shift the tool, obviously that changes your technique, which comes to a question from Chris Coleman. Chris, it's so great to see you. Thanks for joining us. Chris is a longtime fan of the work that you do in visual thinking, and actually a fantastic illustrator himself. But he's asking, how do you feel your style has evolved over time? You spoke a little bit to your influences, but potentially also, is it sometimes you just experiment with different tools and see how that shapes or influences your style?
Yeah, so if you look at my work, you'll see, and you follow me, you'll see that I do I'm really into experimentation. So I don't know where I discovered it, but I discovered the Pocket Pentel brush pen, which is easy to carry in a pocket. It's got a cap, but it's a full brush with cartridges. And then my friends at Baron Fig made a really great little notebook, super small pocket-sized notebook of the Baron Fig Confidant. So when I was traveling to New York City and other places, I could stick that little tiny notebook in my back pocket and have my Pentel brush pen and typically a Flair pen. And I would go into restaurants, and it was such a small package, it was easy for me to capture these experiences. And often I would show it to the people who ran the restaurant. They would really enjoy it, take pictures. So it became sort of a social opportunity. As far as my style over time, I think some things I've discovered is if I look really far back, back in high school, I could not write upper and lowercase letters. Like I really got into this architect hand kind of look, right? And I wrote everything this way. And I felt it was really limiting, and I had to force myself over probably like 2 years to write everything upper and lowercase. And I think that played a benefit in my handwriting getting improved, although I certainly can have my messy moments. It led to having that as a component. Something probably recently in the last 3 years, I've really been interested in script, whether it's brush script with that brush pen or writing faux script with any kind of pen, and either just single line faux script, which is it looks like script, but it doesn't have the thicks and thins, and you can fake those by thickening parts, right? So that's been an interesting thing because it's a little bit softer. And then also sort of bringing back in, all caps for emphasis. So if there's something I really want to emphasize, I might do a mix of like regular lettering, and then I'll switch into script, and then I might go into all caps and mix them up. And then if I really want to punch it, maybe I do something bold and compressed. So all that study of typography has helped me in a lot of ways because I have this catalog of my imagination of typefaces that I can draw from and turn into lettering in my sketchnote. So if you look at my work, you'll see that lettering is a really strong part of it. I would say that the part that I'm weakest at is actually portraits. I think portraits are really tough because I always feel like I want to capture the best side of someone. I see the best sides of people, and I feel unless I can capture them in a way that sort of flatters them or makes them feel the best that they are, like I'm always afraid that I'm going to do something to make them like, I hate that drawing of myself, and it ruins the whole thing for that person. I haven't actually experienced that. Most people are really appreciative, and probably because I pressure myself to try and capture those portraits as accurately as possible with pictures and such. But I would say, yeah, faces and probably hands. Of course, everyone would say hands are tough to draw as well.
Yeah, I agree. Although there's some people in the ImageThink team that really, really love hands.
Maybe I need to talk to them.
Yeah, we can have a tutorial on hands. But I agree, but they can be very expressive, definitely. Yeah. One question, and then we have so many to cover. There's some great questions coming in around applications, and again, I like how you're a practicalist, about applied and what this looks like for people. So I know you'll have great answers and thoughts around that. And then also, we're on this virtual space. So we really want to hear about that transition for you too. Before we move on from that, another question that came up is sort of around synthesis. So merging two comments. There's a comment from, I think it was Bob, who said, he feels that professional work that's too beautiful or too expertly drawn to him can actually distract people from the true meaning of what's captured. And curious if, what your thoughts are around that. Clearly, you're an accomplished illustrator, so you have that skill, but do you feel that sometimes can kind of work against the experience?
Well, it sounds like for Bob, that's the case. So I can't deny his experience. I would say that the thing I see a challenge around really good illustrators is often they get hung up in the details of the drawing and lose the analysis of the moment. I know I've caught myself doing it, so I'm not throwing stones at anybody but myself. So I always say I would rather see a really, really sketchy, loose, imperfect sketch note that actually captures the concept a beautiful illustration of the point, right? And I think it's uncommon to see like a beautiful drawing that doesn't capture the point. I think it's being captured, but I think sometimes you can sort of find yourself so lost in the drawing part of it that you're missing maybe the connections in subtle ways that only the person who's catching it might notice. So I think it certainly could be a distraction for someone. I find some other distractions are really busy sketch notes where you're just filling the page with so much information because you're afraid to make a decision about I'm not going to capture that. And that comes into another design principle, white space, right? White space refocuses your attention on the things that are in the space, right? It's part of the image as much as the drawing is, right? The space that you leave is much part of that as anything. And so when you really put too much information on a page, it's really hard to consume. And I could see almost like a cognitive overload for someone where if they don't know where to begin and it's just too much information, they may never begin. So there's another challenge, right? That having something too overloaded could be a problem as well. So there's a variety of challenges that we face doing any kind of visual work to find balance and structure and white space and style that walks these lines and balances all these parts.
Yeah, that's true. Definitely, you can run into some problems with white space. Claude might be running because we have so much more content, but it's been awesome. I see that they've captured some hands for us there too.
Yeah,
I'm going to ask this kind of in two parts because Lisa Rothstein has a great question that dovetails kind of the opposite of the first part of the question, which is, since you started in 2006, kind of developing Sketchnotes, and I started, or 2007 rather, I started 2006 working as a graphic facilitator. In my opinion, I think I've seen a shift in the business world, certainly around the power of visuals. And I'm wondering if, I think you played a large part in that in terms of building a community, building Sketchnote Army, and you founded Official Sketchnote Day, which is incredible. We talked already about how those are a little bit different, the two disciplines, but I'm curious, have you felt that things have shifted in those, 13 plus years you've been doing this work?
I think in a lot of ways, of course, there's more people doing it. So there's lots of Germans that really have jumped on the sketchnoting and also graphic recording and graphic facilitation space. So there is definitely an international movement. I mean, back when I started this in 2007, I had no clue that, 10 years later or something, there would be, I think there's an international sketchnote camp happened 3 times in Hamburg, actually 4 times, Hamburg, Portugal, Paris, and then we almost had Belgium, but things didn't work out. So, I mean, there is definitely a community that's grown up around it, sort of self-selecting and seeing the work and wanting to be part of it. I think there's also a change in that there's lots of school teachers, both at elementary and secondary and even at college levels, who are realizing the benefits of visualization for their students as just another communication and a way of expressing and capturing ideas for both retention and organization and making sense of things. So teachers are another component. When I wrote the books that we had not really considered, really at the time, we didn't even know if the book would sell. We thought it was really good. And our target market were people like me, user experience and other designers who were sort of the ones doing it at the time. But now here, several years later, we've actually got school teachers that are implementing it and finding it really valuable for their students and a way to kind of, like we talked about, wanting to have some way to keep yourself busy in a class. Like, why couldn't we leverage that for students that really have to be kinetic to have something to do that's intentional, that actually benefits them, right? So there's another thing. I think the last thing I'll say is I think there's definitely been a push towards more visualization. Maybe it has to do with the capacity of the internet to support this, right? So in 2007, us doing this event would be really painful, expensive, and not many people would show up, right? Because the technology wasn't there, not to the degree that it is now. So technology had a part to play in it, emphasizing sort of our visual natures, because we are built to be visual. So like things like Instagram or, any of these software tools where they rely on seeing things, TikTok and even Facebook and other things, right? There's all this visual information for you to process that I think now it's become possible that you can actually deliver that stuff in an effective way, and it's democratized where regular people can have huge followings and have an impact and use visuals effectively. So I think that those three things probably have had an impact and probably are tied together, and there may be even more that I'm not considering that had an impact as well.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I always tell people, that ImageThink didn't invent the idea of visuals as a leadership tool. It really started 30,000 BC in cave paintings, right? Yeah. But certainly, I think that in the time that we've been in the space, there's been a prevalence of or a shift of, first it was early adapters, and now we work with companies of all sizes, kind of across industry. But at the same time, there's still occasionally resistance to it, which I think comes to Lisa's question, which is she's asking how to demonstrate the ROI of sketchnoting or use cases for people in terms of visual thinking and business. So I think that, that's an interesting question. There's a lot of neuroscience. If you've joined us before, we had a neuroscience on. And as you're saying, Mike, I think people are recognizing there's such a surfeit of information, and we do enjoy consuming information visually. But when asked kind of what, where are the hard facts for this as a tool, what do you point to anything, or for you, as you're saying, for sketchnoting, it's usually for the individual, for the student, or for the journaler? Is that something that you encounter at all?
Well, kind of going back to my epiphany when I first did sketchnoting, is I did it for myself first, but then I discovered that other people found value. Even people that weren't at the event could still get value from it. So I think probably the ROI, and I don't know if there's numbers associated with it, would be there's always going to be value in business for someone who can take lots of conflicting and confusing and overload of information, analyze it, make sense of it, and map it out and maybe tell a story with it using visuals in a really compact way. Because if you think about the situation we're in now with COVID-19, so many people I'm working at home, right? I've been home since March. There's lots of people. We're sort of getting, in some ways, overloaded with, as great as these meetings are, right? Like there's a sort of peak Zoom meeting that you can reach, right? Like I don't want to watch a replay of 10 Zoom meetings from earlier today, right? So if there's someone who is assigned to do that work and capture the gist of it and show you sort of the high level analysis, that could be really valuable for an executive, especially. If an executive is given a choice of having to read, 20, 45-page Word document notes with every last note of the thing, and then have to watch the videos to go with it, like I think they would probably turn around and run screaming, right? So if there's a way where you can consolidate this information in a really high-level way, and maybe, I think about it almost as levels of detail, right? So a sketchnote or graphic recording is sort of a level of detail that's in some ways maybe like an executive summary, right? Mm-hmm. It sort of captures the concepts. It's someone's making an analysis and giving you their take on what they heard. If you don't believe it, okay, well, you can go rewatch the whole hour meeting and, verify that information if you wish. And then if someone, maybe had written detailed notes that they included, maybe you can do searchability and stuff, right? There's different degrees of detail that you could provide, and maybe that's all part of it, right? It's a sketch note at one level and detailed notes below it, and then a link to the recording at the bottom, right? Why couldn't that be a really valuable ROI deliverable? You go as deep as you've got time for, and then you've got a reference if you ever have to go back to it.
Right. It's sort of the way you were saying earlier that we're reading short form writing now, right? Sometimes they even tell you like 3-minute read. The New York Times does this thing now where basically they bullet point the high level ideas in the article before you go down to the article. So there's evidence that we're trying to process, information in different densities all over the place.
Yeah.
now here we are, to your point, like working virtually and having, our interactions inside these windows. And I'm curious, and we have a question also from the audience on LinkedIn around how has working virtually changed your practice? What tools are you using? And I know that you've been developing some really interesting things around, building community and teaching using a virtual platform. So what would you like to share with us about how this has shaped your work over the last few months?
Yeah, so I mean, I have been since the iPad Pro came out, I've been an early adopter and the key thing for me with the iPad Pro wasn't so much the iPad Pro itself, but the pencil and the integration with the screen because of the high quality drawing ability that I could produce. And then the software that was available to do things like you're seeing Claude doing right now, right? Being able to work with layers and colors and make modifications. So I was a pretty relatively early adopter. I think my first one was a 9.7 iPad Pro and a pencil. And it was a huge game changer for me in the work setting as a user experience designer. I used it for capturing notes in meetings, and so that was an early tool. So I found that really useful to be able to do sketch notes on an iPad, and then they're very easily shareable. Again, as we talked about that ROI question, having a sketch note that I could, half an hour after I kind of go through and check for typos and tweak things up, to share that with my team on my take of what we talked about for the last hour, right? That they could be refreshed or whatever. So that's one thing. I think having the power to do video. So another nice thing about the iPad is I can plug it into my Mac with a cable and share it. So I can actually do live drawing with other people, a lot like what you see Claude doing, right? The same kind of idea. There's level 2. And then for analog, I've done some teaching. So you sort of alluded to this teaching work that I'm doing. I've found ways to use my my iPhone with a cable and some software to actually project my notebook. So if I want to work in an analog way and show that, I can share that through the computer in a visual way. Probably the last thing I would say for tools that I find useful would be a tool called Miro or Mural. They're two tools that are really popular right now. Probably the limitation is they're not great for drawing, simply because drawing tools are just not that common. It's more common to see a mouse or a trackpad, and they're not great for drawing. But for many other things like sticky notes and being able to build things collaboratively, I think that's where the value of those come in. And certainly you could draw something on an iPad or in an analog way, take a photo and then drop that into a Miro or Mural board and work with those tools to make use of visuals and writing and stuff like that. So those are some of the ways that I'm finding it useful to communicate and collaborate.
Great. So, so the iPad, Procreate, no surprise there. And then you're even working with your teams in some of these collaborative visual platforms, even though drawing isn't necessarily part of it, but they are inherently visual, those programs, right? Even if we're not able to draw,
Yes.
we're able to act in them. Great. So now it's something else that, I really appreciate about you. Obviously, your sketch notes are beautiful. You've broken it down. You've been able to really speak about it in a design language, but how people can apply it. Is really, though, the amount of community building and teaching that you've done over your career. So, I mentioned the Sketchbook Army. You've been involved in a number of things virtually lately these days. So I'm curious, and you talked about Sketch Camp, which I didn't even know about. How amazing is that? That would have been a camp I would have died to go to when I was, 13.
Yeah.
What do you think the Sketchnote Army and the Sketchnote community brings to people? Why has it been such a success? What is it tapping into? We talked a little bit about how it's easy for people to ingest, but for people to do, what do you think that if you had to sort of summarize that community and characterize it, how would you?
I would say it's a very welcoming community. I think if you go back, Sketchnote Army has been around since 2009, so it was only 2 years after I began the experimentation. And what I realized was there was lots of work going around, but there was no central place to really find it. And so I felt like, well, why don't I just make the place? So I reserved the space and started posting the things I was finding as a way to share it and say, hey, this is really interesting. Check this out. And it was a focus on the variety. And then later, when I had my book, the Sketchnote Handbook, that really influenced me. The idea that there's a community out here of people with different styles led me in the book, the Sketchnote Handbook, to emphasize the variety. So I invited lots of other people to submit samples. I managed all those, submissions. Invited other sketchnoters to have full spreads in the book so they could explain sketchnoting and techniques with a full 2-page spread in the book to really show that there's many ways to do it. I think sort of the emphasis was there's no one way to do it. It's not the Mike Rohde way of doing sketchnoting. Sketchnoting is just something I stumbled onto and has worked for me, and I knew that would work for others, and it has. And opening it up for other interpretations just makes it a lot more inviting and approachable. And I think that the core of all those things continued. So, the way that early on people were invited and welcomed and encouraged them to then do the same for other new people that came, or to tell friends, or to become, in many ways, evangelists of the idea and then bring other people in. So it's sort of a self-perpetuating engine in some ways of once you sort of set the criteria and this is how we work, and this is people like us do things like this. I think that's a Seth Godin quote, right? Is that was sort of what was set really early on. And then there was just a real, we sort of established the mindset of sharing and encouragement and help, right? So if someone needed help, they could ask in this environment and people would be there to help them. And I think that then led to everything else. So like the International Sketchnote Camp came from 4 German women that were really into sketchnoting, and they wanted to do something physical. So they just did it, right? So bound into it too was a little bit of a mindset of doing it yourself, right? You don't have to necessarily ask anyone for permission. We invite you to come and do your thing, and we'll support you. So that I think is also a less visible, but in there. And so, each year some other group would take that Sketchnote camp. So the second one was in Portugal, and then the third one in Paris. And, this September we would have done one in Belgium had we not had a virus, right? And it probably would have continued. So there's definitely, it's sort of a community sort of building itself in a lot of ways, but a lot of it was establishing sort of the principles and the way we work early on. And then it's just been continuing. And then that group kind of polices itself. And I think it sort of draws people that are interested in those ideals. So that's sort of, it's just sort of been a real fun experience. Probably the proudest thing in my work is seeing that a community is formed around this.
Yeah, it's tremendous. I mean, it sounds like anyone can become a new recruit for the Sketchnote Army, right? Mm-hmm. Sort of self-recruit, self-identify.
Yeah.
And for those people who are going to do that, what words of encouragement or tips would you give someone who's about to embark on this Sketchnote journey?
Yeah, I would say coming back to the basics, the 5 basic shapes. Really focus on keeping it simple and working, and think of everything as an experiment. So I think that's a really helpful mindset. When you start with really basic elements, you constrain yourself. And then maybe you begin with recorded talks like TED Talks or something where you have control over the pause. So if something's going too fast, you can certainly pause it, right, and have control over the flow of information until you get to where you feel confident that you could do it live, right? So there's no reason that you have to throw yourself off into the deep end. So starting with those simple shapes, think of everything as an experiment. So if something goes wrong, don't beat yourself up over what you did wrong, but learn from that. Like, what did I do wrong here? Maybe I was just trying to do too much. What if on the next try, I sort of, I stop myself. Like I can only write something down every 2 minutes or something, right? Some way of metering yourself. And then finally, I think the last thing is to give yourself lots of grace, because it's lots of cognitive work that you're doing, this analysis. It's really exciting and it's really valuable. And I think you remember a lot more and it's enjoyable. So you can definitely get in a flow state if that's something you want to get into. But you have to have lots of grace for yourself, because it's going to take time to get up to speed And you have to just be okay with that. Think of that whole thing as an experiment, and to see how it builds over time, so that you're not putting all this pressure. I have to be as amazing as Claude. That the first time I try it, well, Claude's got lots and lots and lots of experience to produce the level of quality that you see. So you cannot compare yourself to Claude's work, because Claude is a different person and had a different experience, and everything that has come before has influenced the work, right? So you have to be who you are and have grace for yourself, and look for progress. I think that's really key too, is focus on progress and not on some artificial, I have to do X number of this, or like often that can backfire on you. Focusing on progress is way better.
So to summarize some of those that was a lot of gems, right? Is like us, we also have people start off with TED Talks or something that's coherent, also like an excellent speaker. So you can pause to take the pressure off yourself, right? Don't try to be Claude right away.
Yeah.
Grace. I love the way you said that, grace, right? And leaning into mistakes. For us, when we were working analog, there is no erasing, and you're in front of people. So how do you just adapt and be very adaptive to things that happen? So that's also a great takeaway as well. And then learn from the things that maybe you didn't love about your work or your capture. So hopefully that answers some of those questions around getting started. And before we wrap up, Mike, it's been so great to get a chance to connect with you, even though it's virtual. It's been too long. I want to give you a chance. What's next for you? Where can we find you next? Where will you be hosting or part of a community event for folks that are interested and want to be enlisted in the Sketchnote Army? Tell us where we can find you, and also what's coming up for you that you'd like to share, so we can share with the audience here on LinkedIn.
Sure thing. I'm really active these days on Instagram, although I'm also on Twitter. Both those handles typically are always Rohdesign, ROHDESIGN. You can find my site at rohdesign.com. I would encourage you to go to sketchnotearmy.com and just sort of look through the archives. Something new that's coming I can mention in September is the Sketchnote Army podcast, which is kind of funny to have a podcast about visual things, but actually really works, is interviewing really interesting visual thinkers from all over the place in those podcasts. So that's coming soon. And then, there's going to be a variety of activities coming up, I'm sure, where I'll be appearing online and doing some teaching. And I'm sort of in the skunk works. I can say that I'm working on some live workshops where we're going to be doing really fun exploration of sketchnoting and building skills for those who are sort of in an intermediate level. So that's definitely happening soon. And then, of course, probably the last thing I can mention is my worked on a Kickstarter campaign for something called the Sketchnote Idea Book, which you can find at sketchnoteideabook.com. It's a notebook that's really designed for sketchnoters, with really thick white paper and a polymer cover that will take a beating, and references, if you're a new sketchnoter, for the basic shapes and the different layouts you can consider inside the front and back covers.
That sounds awesome. I've seen that on Kickstarter, and it looks great. I think there's some perforated paper in there too.
Right.
Yeah.
I have a library page.
It out. Lined notebooks are banned anywhere near me in the image think office.
You'd love these.
Yeah. Too constraining. Never liked that. Never liked coloring books as a kid. I didn't want anybody else, putting their ideas on me. So I love the free form that you have. Well, thank you. Thanks, Mike. So you heard it. Follow Mike, visit Sketchnote Army, and stay tuned for some online courses. It sounds incredible, like an incredible opportunity to be able to work with you on those, Mike, and the Sketchnote Idea Book coming out. So thanks so much. Thanks for joining us, everybody on LinkedIn. Round of applause for Claude. Not an easy task to have to capture visually from one of the pioneers in the field. So hats off to you, Claude, and thank you again, Mike. Thanks for joining.
Not a problem. Claude, I tried to give you as many word pictures as I could, so hopefully that helped a little bit. Great job.